We're driving like 65 miles an hour down the highway. I overcompensated and my car flipped 6 times. And I like stand up and I'm like, where's Christy? On the other side of my car, laying on her back in the middle of the highway. I really had to come through the thought process of that my actions or reactions ended up taking the life of another person. When you stuff grief down inside of you, it's
going to come out.
It's going to come out.
Tell us about Sydney.
We get the MRI. We walk down the hall. I see her neurosurgeon. I see the look on his face. And he said, it's not operable. We can't remove it. I can't say you won't die from this. I said, but we will do all that we can medically and leave it all in God's hands. She just looked at me with this resolve and she's just like, okay, like I'm in. Compassion from the Latin word compati, which means to suffer with. And sometimes that's what real compassion is to be willing to suffer with somebody.
Welcome to the Mending Piece by Piece podcast, where we talk about all things loss and explore the diverse and personal experiences of grief and healing journeys that follow. Today, we have a deeply inspiring guest, Tasha Ives, who has faced unimaginable loss, yet continued to find hope and healing. And at just 19, she was involved in a tragic car accident that took the life of her best friend, an event that left her grappling with immense sorrow. And years later, she faced another heartbreaking loss when her beautiful 11-year-old daughter, Sydney, passed away from brain cancer. Despite all the devastating experiences, Tasha was able to find inner peace and healing. And today she joins us to share her journey of survival and resilience and the powerful role that faith and hope has played in her healing. So thank you for coming on here today to share your story with us, Tasha.
Thank you so much.
And welcome.
Me. Thank you. I am honored to be a guest here with you today, and I've already enjoyed just chatting with you here a little bit and connecting with you.
Yeah. Yes. And I am really glad that you are here to share your story, because I know that it's going to help so many people just with where your journey has brought you and the hope that you have and instilled in others. So before we get started about your story and what you've been through, could you just let the listeners know, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, family, whatever you want to share.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Tasha Ives. You said
Ives, sorry.
You would be amazed at how many people mispronounce Ives. And so I was kind of giggling because we hear it all different ways. Also, my middle initial is D, so I'll get Tasha Dives a lot also. But no, I live in the Nashville area. I've lived here since 2015. I'm originally from Rockford, Illinois, which is just northwest of Chicago, right on the Wisconsin state line there. I'm the youngest of 3 daughters, and we're all pastors' daughters. And sometimes we lived up to all the things people say about pastors' daughters, but we've gotten our lives all straightened out and back in order.
All the good things.
All the good things, yes. We were never rebellious ever. But my mom and dad have been married 68 years now, I think, and it's just I love my family. Giant family on both sides that were really tight. So my dad's family and my mom's family all migrated up to Illinois from Northwest Arkansas. They didn't know each other down there, but they met even though they were born like 15 minutes from each other, met in Illinois. And so I've had this wonderful opportunity to be surrounded by family where my cousins were like extra siblings and all of the things. So I've had a really tight family relationship that way, and in our church world as well, and just really blessed with that. I'm married to my husband, Dean, for 26 years. Valentine's Day will be 27 years. And
congratulations.
Thank you. And we have 2 children. Our son Carson is 23, and here in September, he will be married for a year to Lindsay, and they are the sweetest couple. He's a full-time musician here in Nashville. My whole family has musical backgrounds. We have a lot of nieces and nephews in recording industry down here. And Carson is a full-time musician and producer in his little studio. And it's just fun to watch him do his thing. And then our daughter Sydney is in heaven, as you said. She would be 20, turning 26 this year. And so she passed away in 2009 from a brain tumor. But yeah, that's our life in a nutshell. I just wrote a book that is called So Far, A Journey Through Grief and Beyond, that I feel like I've been writing for all of my life in one form or another. I started writing, and journaling was a really good way for me to get all of the thoughts that are in my head. When I have this loud, big, boisterous family, and I'm one of the younger ones in the family and the youngest sibling, I wasn't going to share all my feelings and be interrupted by, pass the green beans or whatever. So I just kind of learned to write everything down to where I wasn't interrupted in my thought process. And I just have found that to be completely kind of a healing thing for me and a way for me to process things. So that's how I really did with these grief moments that we had. That's what I ended up doing quite a bit. And so all of that finally culminated in this book, which is I too, because I had a large family and because my dad was a pastor, we had a lot of death and dying around us. So I was familiar with that. I think I went to a funeral like once a year for my entire life, if not more, because our family's musical. My sisters and I would sing at like every funeral that my dad officiated. And so I was, around it a lot.
You were comfortable, kind of thrust into that.
Yeah, I use the term comfortable, that it wasn't foreign to me. I didn't love it. I didn't love the idea of it. But then when it got into my own personal grief in later years, I did become thankful for my exposure to it earlier in my younger years, that it wasn't such a, because I do see a difference between my husband, who never had an up close personal loss until our daughter died, and then this exposure that I had. So yeah, but that's just a little bit about our background. Yeah. I currently just work part-time at this little running store here, as I have my own podcast and other things in my personal mission that I'm kind of doing on the side and trying to build that up to be more of my full-time life. But just enjoy being a mom and a wife and all the things, you know what I'm saying? All the things in between.
Yeah, I do. But thank you for sharing all that. And we definitely have connected on, and we said a little bit when we were chatting, like we don't know exactly what we've been through, but like when I heard part of your story, I was like, oh, I can connect. I wanted to hear more about it. And it's interesting. I didn't know that about you being familiar by going to funerals a lot when you were younger. And I was trying not to laugh, but in our family history, the name Keenan, so somewhere back in Ireland, and it has it on there, it said the name came from their job, which was they were wailers at funerals.
They were like professional.
So it meant something like they had a wail.
Mourners.
Like, yes. And I was like, I guess I was born into the right family, because I get that.
Serendipitous a little, right?
Yeah. Yes. I can appreciate though, like what you were sharing, like how it was different with your husband. Like you kind of had some level of comfort, but it's definitely different when you are actually the one mourning and grieving a loss. So it didn't take you completely by surprise, but you were like, oh, I understand some of this, but it was definitely different.
Yeah, I was definitely experiencing it in a different way than I had prior to being kind of around that, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So before we talk about your daughter, you had a tragic car accident when you were 19 that took the life of your best friend. And I'm wondering, how did that event shape your understanding of grief and loss, like at such a young age? And how did you cope with that?
Yeah, it was devastating to me. I met Christy when I was 16 and she was 15, and she was, even though I said I was a pastor's kid, she was one of the first young people I had ever met that didn't care what anybody thought about her as far as her love for Jesus. She just kind of shined that, and it wasn't about you had to be cool or she just That just was her whole bubbly personality. And so she just had this energy and light about her, and literally walked up to me my first day of school, which was second semester of my sophomore year at this new school, and comes up, walks out of the crowd, all of these people. I'm just kind of walking around looking, and walks up and has this beautiful blonde hair and tanned face and blue eyes. And she's like, "Hi, I'm Christy." And like, that was it. The rest was history. I had just met my best friend. So losing her, and it being in such a graphic and tragic and sudden way, was very difficult, especially because I blamed myself for it because I was driving. So it was nothing, I wasn't like recklessly driving or anything. It was, she had done something really funny. I looked over at her, and I'm laughing. We were driving like 65 miles an hour down the highway from like Chicago area to Rockford. And I kind of veered over under the shoulder of the road a little bit, hit a mile marker. And when I turned my wheel, to get back up into the lane, I overcompensated and my car flipped 6 times. And I very vividly remember 3 times, like sky pavement. And we weren't wearing seatbelts. And then I was like catapulted out of my car going 65 miles an hour. I was thrown 75 feet from the car. I landed in the grass median in between the, four lanes, eastbound and westbound lanes. I landed on my feet and rolled onto my side into the ditch. And then my car kept rolling. And I just was like on adrenaline at that point. And I like stand up and I'm like, "Where's Christy?" I was completely uninjured except for a big cut on my leg and some glass in my hand. But I was totally lost a shoe, just random things. But was looking for her, spotted her on the other side of my car, laying on her back in the middle of the highway, and just severe trauma and graphic things that I don't need to describe, but just severe trauma to the back of her head. And I was just like screaming and whispering and trying to get her to wake up. And again, before the days of cell phones for the most part, but a nurse behind us had a bag phone, and she got somebody called to come. And anyway, it was just that they had pronounced her. Well, they said we lost her when we were on the highway. I remember them coming over and shoving her bloody rings onto my fingers my hand was cut, but they were just taking off all of her stuff before she was too swollen to take her rings and jewelry off. And they put them on my hands, and they said we lost her. They had put a sheet up so that I couldn't see everything that was happening, put me in an ambulance. They airlifted her and they revived her before she got to the hospital where her parents came. And they just could never get the bleeding to stop. And her parents got to say goodbye, but she did die the next morning on Easter Sunday that year. It was April 11th of 1993. And so, yes, instantly, I just even remember in the hospital, I didn't want to see her parents. She was an only child. And of course, they were loving and kind to me. And, but I just instantly started feeling that guilt, like I don't want to see them. And then we had hundreds of people up in the waiting rooms at the hospital. Everybody's crying. Everybody's sad. I'm like, I caused all of this pain for these people. And I understand that. And people kept saying, like, if it's, and I do believe this in my heart of hearts, a person's not going to leave this earth before a number of days. Like if it was Christy's time to leave, it wouldn't have mattered if you were driving or not. But it mattered to me because, you know what I'm saying? Like, I understand what they were trying to say, that it wasn't, accident and it wasn't intentional. But I really had to come through the thought process of that my actions or reactions ended up taking the life of another person. And I was 19, and there weren't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean.
And there weren't, you couldn't get on Facebook and find support groups. You couldn't Google. I mean, I didn't know anybody else that had done that, that had been the driver when someone was killed. I didn't know anybody. And my parents did what good parents do. And they found someone like you probably that they wanted me to come talk to. And I talked to them and I'm just like, yeah, you know, you just kind of go through the motions. But for me, I felt I deserved to feel guilty. I thought that's what I deserved. I didn't deserve to feel free of that. And I tended to either stuff it because I needed to be okay for everybody else. I needed to make people comfortable enough to be around me because I had already lost my best friend. And if I made it too weird and they didn't know what to say, then I was going to lose other people too. And I couldn't handle it if I saw pity in their eyes, right? I made it like impossible for them because I wanted them to know and understand and get me, but nobody could get me because nobody had lived through that. And I didn't want to be pitied by anybody at the same time. So I'm sure I was very perplexing for people to figure out. And it did come out in negative, self-destructive ways. When you stuff it down, when you stuff grief down inside of you, it's going to come out. It's going to come out, just like cancer. If you pretend cancer isn't there, it doesn't make it go away, and it's going to grow and it's going to fester and it's going to spread through your body and it's going to, have side effects and probably be, you're more worse off than if you would have just dealt with it in the first place and acknowledged it. And so for me, that's kind of what happened. And I let people in my life who didn't treat me well because I thought that's what I deserved, right? Because I thought I had killed my best friend. And to be honest, I don't know what specifically, but I had some good friends who stayed in my corner, who were willing to be uncomfortable. One of the doctors we've worked with at St. Jude, Dr. Justin Baker, who's now at Sanford Children's Hospital out in California, but he was the head of the Hematology Oncology Fellowship, and then he was also in charge of the palliative and end-of-life care at St. Jude. But he gives a lecture on compassion and explains compassion from the Latin word compati, which means to suffer with. And sometimes that's what real compassion is to be willing to suffer with somebody. And that doesn't mean you have the right words. And that doesn't mean you go in and fix it, but it means I don't have the words, but I'm going to sit here in your grief with you. And I'm willing to be uncomfortable in your grief because it's not really about me. It's about you. And I'm going to sit there with you in this moment. And maybe that's in very uncomfortable silence. But I did have a few friends who hung with me and kind of stuck there by my side. I don't have a date or a time that I can point to that says this was the day that everything started to get better. And I think that's really how grief is. Even when I was writing this book, my editor kept saying, well, what was the thing? And I'm like, what was the thing that kind of turned your, you say with time, but what does that mean? Was there a specific moment? And I'm like, no, that's kind of how grief works. There's not this just specific moment that you're like, oh, I get it all now. Now I understand it all. It literally is a process, but there was this sense of, with God, there was this sense of I needed him to hear me because I think I felt pretty dead inside for the most part. I didn't feel that he was hearing me. I felt very far from him. And I had come across a scripture do you remember? I don't know if you're familiar with these. My parents always had them around their house. They were called Our Daily Bread. They were
I was just going to say, are you going to say Daily Bread? But I was like, just listen. Yeah. I'm very familiar.
Yeah. So
they're still around.
My parents had those kind of all over our house. And I just remember picking one up sometime. And
I have them in the waiting room. Sorry. I have them in my waiting room.
So it was one that was about the scripture of the sparrows. That not one sparrow falls to the ground without God knowing. And how much more important are you than
Matthew 6?
Thank you, Matthew 6. And so it wasn't this like, moment where like, oh, it's all fallen into place and I totally get it. But reading that gave me the hope that healing was possible. Does that make sense? Like, just reading that and hearing that God does care and God is aware, and if he cares what a little common indescript sparrow goes through, and not one of them falls to the ground without God's consent and knowledge, then my car accident, he didn't catch him off guard. And he knows the number of hairs on my head, and he wouldn't take the time to count the number of hairs on my head if he didn't care about the person they belong to, Yeah. And so that kind of awakened that sense in me that there was healing to be found. And I think that's kind of, if there was a moment, that would be kind of a point, that I kind of started to feel that taking place in me.
That's amazing. And actually, it may not be Matthew 6, because Matthew 6, well, different translations, he does talk, it's the Sermon on the Mount about, all the birds in the sky. Do they have to worry about anything? Yes. The lilies in the field. But I'm not sure if it's the sparrow and fallen, but it's probably the similar scripture. But it's something I reference a lot. And I can really connect with you on that piece, because for me, when I lost my brother, I felt like everything in this world I did not know. I could not trust. I didn't know what was real, but I felt like, okay, I'm going to hold on to God. And I don't have it on today, but I have a bracelet, and it starts with faith, because I felt like that was all I had. And then it has like hope, strength, hope, and then love. And I felt like in the faith, it was just like, hold on, it was giving me the strength to carry on, just like minute by minute. But that hope that you're talking about, there was hope, because I knew that God, he had me and he loved me. And so I definitely can relate to that. Now, going with my second brother, I felt similar, though, the other way of like that dead, like kind of like I knew it was in the back of my head, but it took a while before I could come back to that. And I think it's a process, and it's so that survivor's guilt is very heavy and complex. And part of what I heard you say is at such a young age too, is like, you were like, I got to stuff this, because nobody else gets it. I don't know what to do with it. I don't want people to pity me. And it sounds like you did a good job of beating yourself up with it internally, like really going through it. And that had to be hard, because you yourself experienced a traumatic event. And I'm not sure how many people were able to recognize like
just the trauma
alone. And like, you needed help with that. And it's not like, just tell me your story, because that's going to make it at that time. You could probably just say the story and you're out here. Yeah. You're just detached from it.
100%. Yeah. And the scripture is Matthew 10:29 through 31. But you had Matthew correct. So,
well, Matthew 6, it's one of the ones I reference a lot, because it's about worry, and it talks about, do the birds in the sky worry, do the lilies in the field. So, but then as you were talking more, I go, wait, that's a different scripture. So I didn't want to get like misquoted.
No. But yes, you're correct in that I think it was easier for everyone. Everyone wanted to think I was okay. Right? I mean, so if I acted okay, they wanted to believe that. And I don't blame anybody for that. I'm not upset about that. In hindsight, sometimes I look back and think because I was involved in like worship team and helped lead a life group and like a few other things. And in hindsight, somebody should have protected me from the pretending, right? Someone should have maybe thought, let's make sure that, because this was a traumatic event. I don't think anybody truly knew exactly what I had witnessed out on that highway, because I don't have a problem explaining it now. I don't necessarily do that publicly for her parents' sake, because I don't think that's helpful for them to hear anything like that. If I'm having a private conversation with somebody, I can tell them what I saw. But I stopped sleeping. I could not go to sleep. I wouldn't go to my bed because bed represented dark, empty thoughts. And so I would sleep in the floor of the den at my parents' house. And again, at that time, we didn't have streaming services or anything like that. And so I would turn QVC on because that was on 24/7. And
it still is.
They were my friends that I could hear talking while I laid there until it got light out again. Because anytime I closed my eyes, I smelled blood. I saw things. I bought a bottle of perfume when we were there. It was called Sun Moon Stars, and it broke in the accident. And there was this sickening smell of like blood and perfume and gasoline. And I would start to drift off, and then I would wake up and smell that, and it would just so I just avoided sleeping, and I would get up and go to work. That summer, my dad had to drive me because in Illinois, if there's a fatality, you lose your license for 6 months. And so he would drive me to work. I would somehow stumble through the day. I wasn't eating a lot. I would come home and I would crash on the couch for like an hour or two because life was happening. It was light out. Life was happening around me. I could hear my mom making dinner.
You felt safer.
Yeah. I could hear mom making dinner, dad doing his thing, maybe watching the news or Wheel of Fortune or something. And there was just the sound of life around me. And I could sleep in that. I would get more rest in that like hour or two when I got off work to kind of prepare me to stay up with my like haunting memories all night. But I wasn't waking up every day going, Mom, I had another horrible dream last night, because like
you didn't share that you were having flashbacks.
Yeah,
you were having flashbacks. And I guess to be fair, back then, PTSD was pretty new, but only because I can remember grad school.
Yeah.
And it was very new working with Vietnam vets and understanding it. And people didn't understand. And even now, like I just finished a certification, I guess a year ago. It was like a 2-year, another additional trauma certification. I was just blown away by what I learned, because we're learning so much as we go on. So like people weren't aware. And if you're not sharing it, and even if you did, not sure were the resources there at that time, but that's a lot for a young person, for anyone to go through, because you're not able to sleep. It's scary. You close your eyes, you're seeing things, you're smelling things, you're hearing things, and you're trying to go on with the world.
Yeah.
But yet you're inside, totally traumatized and tormented. Yeah.
I think it did definitely, I think there's a lot of things that I see still to me in this day that I finally had to just tell my son and my husband to just kind of get over it. But like, it's kind of normal with any person in the car when somebody else is driving that you might get a little nervous. But I have, there's an extra anxiety that I can live through. It's fine. But I prefer to drive, which is weird because I was the one that was driving in that moment. But I know when I'm going to brake. And I know when I'm going to, I don't know what they're doing. And I feel completely out of control if they're driving and I'm not. So, I mean, I'm totally fine. My husband can drive places, and I have learned to, take deep breaths and not scream every time. There's jokes about how wives are when husbands drive in general. And I'll take that and put it like on steroids. Right. And so I've finally just had to tell them, I don't have a lot of anxiety in other areas in my life. I really do feel like I've worked through a big portion of things, but I cannot control the fear and the anxiety that I fear in those moments. I will try to control my reactions in those moments and remind myself, that you haven't gotten in an accident. You're generally a safe driver. But don't get angry at me if I because I can't control that reaction. That is that is a trauma response, if that makes sense.
And have you, either with, and we'll move into talking about your loss of your daughter, did you do any trauma therapy or EMDR with either of the losses?
I haven't. I'm very curious about it now, but I have not. No.
Yeah.
And they weren't, like you said, it wasn't a thing.
It
wasn't. And I don't even know if it was really that well known when Sydney died. I mean, maybe it was a little bit more common in 2009, but it wasn't as talked about, or at least I didn't come across it enough to even like research it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think it just depends on areas too, because, I'm thinking back to that time, like here, it definitely it's different now. You hear it all the time, trauma-informed care.
Sure.
So, and I feel like that's just a buzzword people like to say. I'm not sure how informed people are, but that's a whole other topic. Yeah. But the EMDR that was out there, and certain people had it, but it wasn't like advertised. Sure. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And unless you somehow came across it or experienced it with somebody else sharing it, I think it was a while before, like now, again, because you can Google everything.
Yes. Now
you hear more about it.
Yeah, with it. But at that time, I was not.
Yeah. So tell us something. Tell us about Sydney. Tell us
So she was. Here's a little picture of her when she was little. So this was shortly after my son was born. Sydney was 3 when he was born, and we started having mommy Sydney days so that she could still have her one-on-one time.
Oh, so important.
Yeah. And so this particular time we went to the makeup counter at Macy's, and I was like, we can go get some makeovers done. We did a little shopping, and she got a little lip gloss and mascara, and so that was just one of those moments. But she was a girly girl, but not prissy. So she would be like out in the dirt digging with her dad with a tiara on her head. She's like one of those girls.
I love it.
And she loved to be outside with him a lot, would love to run with him. But she was also musical and artistic. So she liked to sing like the rest of our family. And we have bins and portfolios full of artwork and drawings and all of the things. She wanted to be a fashion designer at one point. So she was always, creating little outfits and things like that. And then, so we had, there was that part of her. And then through the cancer, when she lost use of her she lost all right side mobility. She taught herself how to draw and write and paint with her left hand. So we have some beautiful tree drawings with her left hand that we have, pencil drawings that we have framed in our entryway. And so we have pieces of her, but she was funny. She was really funny, kind of sarcastic, which is kind of my love language. My dad and it just like, we have this wit or humor. And if you have a one-liner that comes to mind, you just have to say it. And even if you're just completely cut it, like I told her, I'm like, Papa can handle it. Mima can't handle it. Mima doesn't want you to make fun of her, but Papa can handle it and he'll give it back to you. So you can't get your feelings hurt. But other adults in general, we don't talk to them like that, but it's allowed because we think it's funny and it's just our thing, but she had really funny one-liners and just an awesome personality. She and her little brother were best buds, snuggled together all the time, and she had her dad and my dad wrapped around her little finger.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. And then when she was very smart, so she was like, talking to her at a young age was like conversing like you and I are, and she was very articulate and could understand concepts and things really well. She started reading really young, just really smart, kind child. She wasn't perfect. She was a very strong-willed, very similar to her mother, but I loved that about her because I was like, it's going to serve her well one day. She's not going to be like just led astray by anybody. She's going to never do something that she doesn't want to do. And I thought I liked that about her, even though it was a challenge to deal with at times.
Yeah.
But she was very kind, and she didn't like I've heard other kids and teachers tell me that if there was a kid sitting alone in the lunchroom, Sydney was going over there to be their friend. And so when she was like 4, she kept asking me about Jesus and asking a bunch of questions about Jesus, which was similar to the age I started asking my dad about Jesus. I'd heard about him my whole life, but I wanted to know more, and I wanted him to tell me more about it. So she kept asking, and I was like, I don't really know if you understand completely. You're 4 years old. She was pretty insistent about it. And I just was like, well, tell me, what is it you want to know about Jesus? Well, he died for our sins. And I said, well, what are sins? And she's like, it's the bad things we do. And I said, and what does that mean? Like, he died. Well, he's our savior. He forgives us. And he's like, and she just was going into the most simple words. It was like the complete gospel that she was telling me.
Yeah.
In these, like, I need him because this, and I realized that. And so I was like, okay, I think to the best of your ability, you have this understanding. So we prayed together that night at 4. And then it was like all of her preschool friends and kindergarten friends, everybody had to come to church with us on Wednesday nights to all of the different programs we had at church. And she just was like, you have to come to church. And, some of these kids
he was just on fire.
He was. And some of these kids are still like living for the Lord today. And it's really cool to see.
Wow.
In their 20s, but she just was that kind of person. She also was a big giant crybaby before she was diagnosed with cancer. So it was kind of humorous in our family with the cousins that if somebody accidentally hurt her while they were playing, she'd kind of start out with this very quiet cry and her mouth would get really big, and they were like, oh no, Sydney, be quiet, because they just knew she would cry this huge cry, and then they would all get in trouble for messing around and doing things. So she was a little bit of a crybaby at that time. So to see her countenance and everything about her change when she was diagnosed set the stage pretty high for how we were going to handle it, because we watched our child walk forward with peace and grace, and it was really convicting. Wow. And so it challenged us to do the same, and we didn't always get it right, but there was just something different this time around. So we were just at a piano lesson. I took her to her first piano lesson when she was 9 and 9.5. This would have been in May of 2008. And when the teacher said, put your hands up on the keys, she put them up and this hand just fell. And she was like picking it up like this to place it on the keys. And I'm sitting behind her and I'm like, Sydney, like, what is happening? How long has this been happening? And she said, a couple of weeks. And I said, well, why didn't you tell mommy? Well, she had a wart right here on her hand that they were treating. And it was where her pencil would sit, just was constantly hitting. And so she'd been using her left hand to write in school. Her teacher had told me she was concerned about her handwriting. She's like, oh, I'm writing with my left hand because my pencil hits here. So we're like, okay. So we weren't realizing that she was using this hand as often. And we didn't have any bad headaches. There was no like nausea, anything like that would indicate a large brain tumor. But when I saw her hand that day, I remembered a couple of weeks earlier, she kept stepping out of her right flip-flop, which we thought it just stretched. She's like, I must have forgotten how to walk in flip-flops. And I'm like, you don't forget how to walk in flip-flops. I bet it just stretched. Well, her toes weren't working and gripping the shoe. So when I saw the hand and I remembered the flip-flop, I'm like, there's a neurological something happening here. And
that's good that you kind of picked that right up.
Yeah.
Like some people might have missed that.
I think because we have so many family members that we've witnessed illnesses and different things, and they've had cancer and whatever. And so I've been up close to that kind of stuff enough that I just recognized it.
You knew something. Yeah.
And so I got on the phone with the pediatrician while the piano teacher kind of kept her occupied for a minute. And that led to an outpatient CT the next day, which showed she had a very large brain tumor in her thalamus. It was the entire left side of her thalamus and butterflied into the right side. And they said she has to be admitted right away. She's a high fall and seizure risk. That led us to UW-Madison in Madison, Wisconsin. Our town of Rockford is a fairly large town, but it only had one pediatric neurosurgeon. And this was Memorial Day weekend. And he was out of town. And so it was either Chicago or Madison. So we went to UW-Madison. There was a children's hospital there. That's where they had us go, and which is about an hour away. And the MRI the next day. So I did what you're not supposed to do as a parent.
And what's that?
I Googled, but
the
way my brain thinks is I need to know what I might potentially be facing to some degree, since I knew it was neurological, and then now I knew it was a tumor. I needed to know what we might be dealing with here. And I call myself now, even though I've had these trauma experiences, a positive realist. So I'm going to always hope for the best, but my experience tells me we don't always get the best outcome. So I'm not denying the worst. So that realist part is there, but I'm always going to hope for the best news, right? So, but I also have to be prepared a little for what I might expect. So I did a little reading and I was just like, I want this tumor to not have fingers. I didn't want it to intertwine in the good tissue. I didn't know enough about the function of a thalamus, all of the things.
Right.
But I did know that much. And so when we took her for her MRI, my husband and I were in there and he's like, what are you doing? And I just was rocking back and forth like this. And I was just like, please don't let it have fingers. Please don't let it have fingers. Please don't let it have fingers. And he just wanted to get her and run because she kept moving. And so then they'd have to start the whole process over. And he just couldn't stand the whole process for her. But all of that to say, then we get the MRI. We walk down the hall. I see her neurosurgeon. I see the look on his face. And I said, it has fingers, doesn't it? And he said, yeah. And he said, it's not operable. We can't remove it.
Oh,
and
wow.
So we had to do...
Was she present when he said this?
She was not present in that moment.
Okay.
She knew she had a large brain tumor. I had to explain that to her because she knew something wasn't working. She was 9.5. So we had to, it's not like she was 2. She knew things weren't working right and that there was a problem. So she did not know that part. They did a biopsy the next day, Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. And we were all sitting around this table. We were about the only family in the waiting room because they're not normally doing surgeries on the Saturday before Memorial Day. This doctor who I use as an example now for how you should relate, like we help teach doctors and staff at St. Jude on how to deliver hard news and have difficult conversations. And he's like the gold standard for me. So he comes out, he sits down and he said, it appears to be, I had the pathologist in there, it appears to be grade 3 cancer. And then he just sits there with that. And I said, okay, have you ever seen anyone with this, any child with this kind of tumor go on to live a normal life expectancy? And he put his...
You asked that.
I asked that. And he put his hand on my hand and he said, no, I'm sorry, I have not. It wasn't too many words. He didn't get too clinical. He gave the bullet points of what I needed to know. He didn't like try to hide away from what it was. He was direct but compassionate with as few words as possible. And then he answered my questions honestly. And so their team wanted to tell her the news. And I said, well, that's all going to come through me. Like, we'll tell Sydney the truth, but it has to, I know her. I know how to talk to her. You can be in the room when I'm talking with her. I'm not going to lie to her, but it needs to be filtered through me because I know how to speak her language. And so we're walking down the hallway to tell our child that she has inoperable terminal cancer.
Wow.
And the whole way down, I feel like I need to be praying for words, right? But there are no, I don't know if you've ever been in this place where you're like, I need to pray, but I don't even know what to pray. And so the whole way down the hallway, I was just saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Like I was like breathing his name. And it's like just his name is like the prayer of 1,000 words, because he knows what we need, even if we don't know what we need.
Yeah. That's what they say, right? The Holy Spirit. He'll grow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we walk in the room. She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, even post surgery. And she's, you know, sitting there and she's just giving me this, like, I'm like, hey, baby girl. And she's like looking at me with the unasked question, because she knows she just had a brain biopsy and she knows why we were looking for that. So I just said, Sydney, it is cancer. It is brain cancer. And she looked at me and said, am I going to die? And, you know, how do you answer that question for your 9-year-old? And again, I didn't have the words. So I just said, Jesus, like, give me the words. And I said, well, we will all die one day. And only God knows how long you're going to live here. And I don't know if you will leave this earth before I do. Like, I, you know, could walk out the door and get hit by a bus. I mean, like, just into the reality. And I said, we have known people who've had bad diagnoses, who weren't supposed to live, who are alive today. And we've known people who were healthy, who are now gone. So I don't know if you will die from cancer. This is a very tricky medical thing. But I can't say you won't die from this. I said, but we will do all that we can medically and leave it all in God's hands. And she just looked at me with this resolve, not this crybaby little girl that child that she had always, like, I couldn't even look at a splinter in her finger before, without her freaking out about it. She just looked at me with this resolve, and she's just like, okay, like, I'm in. And yeah, it was just this faith. And long story short, after all of that, they wanted us to start chemo there, but our pediatrician, who was a godsend, who had originally gone to school to be a pediatric neurosurgeon, but went into general pediatrics, he's like, don't start any treatment there. I might have you accepted at St. Jude, and you can't, this particular protocol, you can't have started any other medication. So hold up. So yeah, we were accepted at St. Jude after that, and then went down there in June of 2008 for her treatment.
Now, St. Jude, was that closer to home?
No, St. Jude is in Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh,
but
I didn't know where it is. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So St. Jude Children's Research Hospital is like the leading hospital for childhood cancers. And if you're treated there, it's free of charge. And all of your living expenses and travel expenses and everything are covered by the hospital. It's a nonprofit organization. And so they're the ones that get the cures for the most part. And then they have the leading edge, kindest treatment for life sustaining, even if you're not going to get cured. So like what that quality would be, right? And so they had a trial protocol there. And then once something is FDA approved, then they will freely share that with any hospital for any child. So they won't charge another hospital for that protocol. They can use that wherever they like, if that's somewhere closer to them. But because this was a trial, it had to be administered there. And it was a targeted therapy. So it was a pill that she would take that was being used for adult lung cancer patients. In fact, my mom's twin sister died of lung cancer, but was on the same medication that Sydney was on. It seemed to work well with the biology of pediatric brain tumors, because the biology is different for an adult lung or an adult brain tumor and a pediatric brain tumor. And so it would attack the cancer cells and leave your good cells alone. So she didn't have, the general sickness of standard chemo. She did have almost full brain radiation for 6 weeks. And that took a toll. It took her vocabulary away for a while, which she got back after residual swelling and such. But we did have to deal with some of those things. But she was never inpatient for anything other than she had to have an emergency shunt placement surgery on her 10th birthday because of residual swelling during radiation and a port placement. Other than that, we were never inpatient for anything. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah. It's so heavy just even listening to it. And I want to go back a little bit because you're saying like, yeah, I can't even imagine like how do you deliver that news to anyone but your child, and you're just like Jesus, you know, and showing up, leading you. Can you remember though going through that and the treatments, like how were you holding up? Like,
yeah. So it was definitely a going through the motions kind of thing, right? Because it's kind of like what you were talking about when your husband had this going on and then your dad had this going on, you know, all these things kind of all at the same time. My point in that moment was just like, my goal was to keep breathing and to keep my daughter breathing and my husband, and to be as much of a mom to Carson, our son, who is 3 years younger also. We were all able to be at St. Jude together at the same time. And so Dean kind of like, it was like the Dean and Carson show, and they kind of hung out and took care of each other. And then I would take care of Sydney. And so I was in charge of the medications that you had to take at a certain time of day, that I would have to put gloves on to protect myself from the medication I'm making her swallow, which is crazy thought in and of itself, but that sort of thing. And then there were times I would sit down and try to read my Bible, and nothing, it was like it would get here and then nothing would like penetrate. You know what I'm saying? Because I was just so overwhelmed and in such a fog. My sister ended up giving me a Streams in the Desert devotional, and that was so good because it was spoon fed, little scripture, little devotional. It was about this much. And
that's all you could absorb. It was
all I could digest at that time.
Yeah.
And not only could I digest it, but it like explained it all to me. You know, it wasn't like I would just have to like figure it out. And so every night I would read that. Sydney and I shared a bed at Target House where we lived there in Memphis, which is like Ronald McDonald House, but just a little different. And we shared a bed, like a queen size bed. And then Dean and Carson had twin size beds in the other room. And I would lay next to her and I would cry out to God, and I would make bargains with God all the time. And one night I was just like, she was getting ready to have her port placed, subcutaneous port for like all IV accesses and such. And I don't know what it was about that night, but I was up making deals with God. And I was like, okay, here's the deal, God. If she's going to go through all this stuff and she's going to suffer and have all this stuff, like just take her while she's asleep for the surgery. Then she doesn't have to suffer. I mean, it's just like the way your brain just kind of starts to resolve it all and figure it all out. And like, you just take her while she's sleeping and then she won't have to suffer and da 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 da. And I just kept praying that, and I was like talking to him. And then I was reminded of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I was reminded that he had to bow to the will of the Father. And he didn't make deals. He said, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, yours be done. And I was like, who in the world did I think I was? If Jesus, the Savior, had to bow or bowed to the will, I guess he didn't have to bow. He could have said no. But if he bowed to the will of his Father, who was I to not do the same? And so in that moment, I just kind of like opened my hands and I let go of everything that I was like gripping so tightly to. And I was like, you have this figured out. and you have a plan and you know the bigger picture that I'm not privy to. I see like this one piece of the puzzle, and there's all of this that I can't see yet. I don't have that view yet. And so not my will, but yours be done. And I felt a freedom and a peace in that. And I'm not going to say like I slept well that night. I will say I took control back a lot. And then I would have to like,
it was that battle.
Yeah. I would have to surrender it back over again and again. But when I tell you that Sydney was instrumental in her example to us, it would be, we would meet someone and they would say, my daughter and I have had a strange relationship. We've been estranged for the last 5 years, but we heard about Sydney and her faith and what's going on in your family, and we have reconciled, and God is working in our lives. And she would say, see, Mom, I told you it was all worth it. I told you that God had a plan.
Wow.
And this,
Sydney saying that to
Sydney
you.
would say that to me.
So not only like, you know, you saw that, you're hearing that from people, your story, her story is affecting people and like planting these seeds, and God's using her. But she is even saying to you, look, like,
look, God has a plan.
It's okay. Yeah. God has me and he has a plan.
And she never, and I'm not trying to make her out to be a saint. Sydney was a flawed human being like the rest of the human beings on the planet. But there was a supernatural something on this child. And I never once heard her say why. Not one time. And there was one time that she said after we came home on hospice, when the tumor grew and spread from her brain, from her thalamus to her brainstem. And you can't operate on a thalamus, just side note, because depending on where it is. I mean, if it was on the very little piece on the outside of the thalamus, but this was down embedded in it. And I had one surgeon explain to me, it would be like, it's the engine of your brain. It would be like a mechanic trying to work on an engine while it's running. Like a car engine while it's running. That's just going to destroy the engine, and the car's not going to run anymore. So it would literally have killed her just to try to do any type of operation. So that just wasn't an option. And so when you're at that place, and when we came home on hospice, there was one time that she said, is there somewhere else we can go? Is there any other medicine? Because I think it was starting. She was having her own little wrestling with God moment, realizing that she was dying. And I didn't tell her that they had given her 6 weeks to live when we came home on hospice care. I just told her the medicine wasn't working any longer, and that there was a phase 1 trial study that they were very honest. They're like, it's not going to cure her. It's going to make her very sick. It's more for our research. We don't recommend it. You can, but some parents will, and I'm not judging them, will be like, let's try everything that we, But for us, we included Sydney in that conversation. And she said, I want to go home and be with my family. And so was really sweet. Her neuro-oncologist didn't share our faith. He had a different faith. And he had a very clinical view, and I had a very faith view. And we met somewhere in the middle. Right. We love him with all of our hearts. And whenever we're on campus, we find him, and we figured out how to work together. And like, okay, if cure isn't possible, like, we know God can do anything and he can do miracles. Yep. And we also know he doesn't always choose to do it the way that we think. So he doesn't always choose to heal people how we think. Healing for Sydney, I believe, was ultimate healing, and she's in heaven and free from illness and pain and suffering and all of the junk in the world today. But we also have seen people who had cancer who don't anymore, and there's no other explanation but God, right? So we were always gonna pray for that. It'd be kind of weird if we didn't, right? It would be really weird if we weren't praying for a miracle for our child. So when I would say, we're doing radiation, are we trying to shrink it, to remove it? He'd be like, very doubtful. And I'm like, well, so the medicine, is that like life prolonging? Well, we hope so. And I just kept asking these questions. Finally, I'm like, okay, let's get on the same page about what our hope is in, because otherwise I'm not here for your research. I'm here to do what's in the best interest of my child. So then we got on the same page where if our hope wasn't in a cure, what is our hope in? So is it in for quality of days, if not quantity? Kind days where she can live out as much as possible. And because if she's just going to be sick, then maybe we should look for something different. And so then we got on the same page, and then we were a team in that effort. But he wasn't a believer in Christ. And she prayed for him every day until her dying breath. And
did he know that?
He knows that. Yes. He hasn't changed his mind. But in that moment when we were giving her the hospice news that we were going to go home on hospice care, I said, Sydney, but who made the medication work anyway? And she looked over at him, gave him a little sideways glance, and nudged him with her elbow. She said, the Lord Jesus Christ. And he just chuckled. He goes, okay, I know. And he's like, I love you too. Because he knew that was her love for him, you know. And so that's what I'm saying. The bar was so high. And so it caused us. Now, to tell you all of the things, I think in those moments, sometimes I don't know if I think it now because of what I've lived through or if it would have been what I would have done prior to that. Sometimes I look at my life and been like, because I did work in hospice care after a while, for a while as well. I think I shared that with you, but I sometimes think I could be a first responder because I can like go in and act immediately and be like, okay, this is what we need to do, this, and this, without any feelings or emotions in the moment. And then later in the private, quiet places, that's when I feel all the things. And so I think a lot of it in those moments was quick decisions, have to do this, have to do the other. Yeah. Sydney had a grand mal seizure when we came home, stopped breathing for several minutes. It was the day my mom had come home from the hospital from having her esophagus removed from stage 3 esophageal cancer.
Oh my.
And my mom is alive and well today, but it was something that had to happen at that time. She kept putting it off, because Sydney was on hospice and she didn't want to miss any of those moments. And they had originally given Sydney 6 weeks. So mom's like, well, I don't want to be incapacitated.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Mending Piece by Piece podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, and share with family and friends. See you in 2 weeks. And until next time, continue mending piece by piece, healing through grief, one step at a time.